The story of the Bible Belt is usually told as if it were carved in stone, as if nothing could ever really shake it, as if the churches that fill its towns and highways were stitched so deeply into daily life that they would outlast every cultural shift around them. But something is happening across that region that almost no one expected, and definitely not this fast. For generations, the Bible Belt was described as impenetrable, a place where faith wasn't just a belief but a default setting. You didn't choose it so much as inherit it. It shaped the local culture, the politics, the schools, the family routines, the holidays, even the way people spoke to each other. It was an ecosystem built to reinforce itself, and for a long time, it worked. But ecosystems don't stay stable when the surrounding conditions change, and the conditions around the Bible Belt have been shifting in ways that are subtle, cumulative, and almost impossible to reverse. You don't see the exact moment a trend begins. You only feel the momentum once it's already moving. Today, indicators from multiple sources, surveys, academic studies, church membership logs, and even first-hand accounts all point in the same direction. The grip of traditional religion in the Bible Belt is loosening. Not evenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Part of this shift comes from something simple. People now have access to more information than ever, and information does something powerful when it's allowed to circulate freely. It introduces alternatives. It introduces comparisons. It introduces questions that older institutions weren't prepared to answer without relying on the same formulas they've used for decades. And formulas stop working when people begin noticing the gaps across younger generations in particular. The old pressure systems, the ones that kept everyone aligned with the same beliefs, don't work the way they used to in the past. You didn't just leave your childhood faith without consequences. You risked social identity, family acceptance, and sometimes your entire support network. But communities evolve, and with that evolution comes breathing room for doubt. And doubt is more powerful in quiet environments than in confrontational ones. What's interesting is that the decline isn't always loud. It's not driven by dramatic confrontations or ideological battles. It's more often a private process, one that happens in small personal steps. Someone stops attending midweek services, then they skip a few Sundays, then they only go on holidays, then not even that. Eventually, the identity shifts quietly, almost imperceptibly, until they no longer describe themselves the way they once did. The structure is still standing, but the people it used to hold have quietly slipped through the cracks. Sociologists studying the region have pointed out that the strongest institutions in the Bible Belt relied heavily on something that doesn't function the way it used to: cultural conformity. Once, you could assume the people around you believed roughly what you believed. But the moment that assumption breaks even slightly, the pressure that keeps everyone in alignment weakens. When a young person sees peers who aren't religious and whose lives continue functioning normally, the spell breaks a little. Add to that the growing access to communities outside the immediate environment, not just online, but through education, migration, media, and work opportunities. The moment someone sees that whole populations live healthy, meaningful lives without the religious rules they grew up with, a question begins forming, not always spoken aloud, but impossible to forget. There's also a generational domino effect that researchers talk about. If even one generation begins to drift from strict religious identity, next generation usually drifts even further. Belief systems passed down through fear or social obligation rarely survive more than 2 generational breaks. And we're now far enough into those breaks that the momentum has its own stability. Another major factor is the gap between the lived reality of people in the Bible Belt and the moral or social teachings they were raised with. When institutions insist on rules that conflict with everyday life rules people can't realistically follow, or rules that contradict basic human experience, individuals eventually adjust their lives or their thinking. And between the two, thinking is usually the easier thing to shift quietly. What complicates everything is that churches still appear full from the outside. The buildings are still there, the signs are still there, the billboards still announce revival weeks. But numbers tell a different story. Attendance has thinned even when membership lists haven't. Participation has dropped even when official statements deny it. Many churches report higher numbers than they actually serve because admitting decline becomes a threat to the institution's identity. Behind the scenes, pastors talk about burnout, about shrinking budgets, about younger families not committing, about older members passing away without being replaced. These conversations rarely leave the walls of leadership, but they reveal the stress of maintaining a system that no longer has automatic cultural fuel. The shift isn't happening because people suddenly woke up and rejected an entire worldview. It's happening because small inconsistencies accumulated over time, because questions were raised but not answered, because sermons kept warning against a world that increasingly failed to match the fear-based descriptions. And when the warnings no longer made sense, the credibility of the institution softened. This is where the cracks become more visible when you look at how people actually organize their daily lives. In many towns across the region, the church used to serve as the center of everything, not just spiritually, but socially. It was where families met, where children played, where friendships formed, where support networks lived. But over the last 2 decades, social infrastructure has expanded in ways that reduce the church's monopoly on community. People now find connection through workplaces, online groups, gyms, volunteer organizations, gaming communities, book clubs, sports leagues. When belonging becomes available through multiple channels, religious institutions lose their exclusive role. Some pastors openly admit that their toughest competition isn't other churches, it's modern life. It's the sheer variety of alternatives for meaning and identity. When people can find purpose, connection, entertainment, and emotional support outside the church, the institution loses one of the strongest incentives it previously relied on. And once a community stops functioning as the default option, participation drops faster than most leaders expect. But the shift isn't only social, it's intellectual. Many people in the Bible Belt grew up with explanations for the world that made sense at the time, because they were the only explanations offered. But when you're exposed to ideas from outside your immediate environment, whether through science documentaries, higher education, podcasts, or even conversations with people from different backgrounds, older explanations start to feel thin. Not because they are necessarily malicious, but because they are incomplete. When a young adult learns about cognitive biases, pattern-seeking behavior, scientific method, evolutionary psychology, historical criticism, and the social function of belief systems, it frames their childhood teachings in a completely different light. It becomes clear that many ideas weren't universal truths, but regional traditions dressed as certainties. And once that recognition happens, it's nearly impossible to return to the unquestioned mindset that once held everything together. Another factor widening the cracks is the increased visibility of internal contradictions. For many people, religious teachings present themselves as timeless and absolute, yet the actual behavior of institutions shifts depending on cultural pressure. When people see doctrines bending to match the direction of social trends, not leading them something doesn't add up. If a belief is divinely mandated, why does it happen to change when enough people push back? That question alone has quietly catalyzed countless deconversions. Take the example of shifting attitudes toward social issues. Many churches that once preached hardline positions later softened or reinterpreted them, not because of new revelations, but because younger generations refused to accept outdated rules. Congregations adapted to survive, but in the process, they revealed that their certainty wasn't as unshakable as advertised. And when moral authority appears negotiable, its power weakens. Economic shifts also play a role in the collapse that few predicted. Many rural areas in the Bible Belt have faced declining industries, shrinking job opportunities, and outward migration of young adults. When people leave these towns, often for education or employment, they encounter new environments where religious expectations aren't dominant, and exposure alone can reshape belief trajectories. When they return home, if they return at all, they often bring a different worldview, one that doesn't slot neatly into the expectations they grew up with. There's a recurring pattern in interviews with young adults from the region. They describe feeling that their questions weren't welcome, that whenever they asked about contradictions, inconsistencies, or factual claims, they were met with discomfort rather than discussion. For a while they accepted those limits, but once alternative answers became available, answers that didn't require shutting down curiosity, the old framework lost its bray. This creates a generational split that families across the Bible Belt are experiencing quietly. Parents who expected their children to inherit the same faith are now watching them reshape their identities. Sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly, sometimes silently. But the pattern is unmistakable. And once a generation begins shifting away from religious identity, the return rate is extremely low. There's also the effect of transparency. Decades ago, religious scandals could stay local, covered up or forgotten. Today, a single incident can reach millions of people instantly, and every headline builds on the last, creating a cumulative sense that something is deeply unstable behind the scenes. Even if many churches are not involved in scandals, the overall perception shifts. Trust declines. And trust is the foundation of any institution that asks people to surrender certainty for belief. The decline becomes even more pronounced when you look at the changing role, the authority. Younger generations grew up in a world where expertise is decentralized. You don't need a local authority figure to interpret the world for you. You can access global information at any moment. And when that information contradicts theological claims, people tend to trust the source that provides repeatability, evidence, and coherence. That doesn't mean everyone becomes antagonistic toward religion, but it does mean they become less willing to accept unverifiable claims as the base layer of their worldview. Another, under-acknowledged, the reason the Bible Belt is cracking is the psychological shift toward internal rather than external validation. Traditional religion in the region often framed morality as obedience, not understanding. But as people learn more about mental health, emotional intelligence, and self-reflection, they begin assessing actions based on harm, empathy, and outcomes rather than adherence to ancient rules. This transition pulls moral authority back into the individual rather than the institution. And once that happens, external enforcement loses power. Something else is happening beneath the surface. People are becoming more comfortable saying, "I don't know," where they once felt pressured to claim certainty. And ironically, that honesty makes rigid belief systems feel less natural. When unanswered questions are met with humility instead of dogma, people naturally gravitate toward the approach that respects complexity rather than denying it. All of this builds into a quiet cultural pivot, not a revolt, not a rebellion, but a gradual shift in how people relate to the world. A shift that makes absolute claims feel less convincing, that makes inherited beliefs feel less binding, and that makes old structures, even the ones that once seemed unshakable, begin to loosen from the inside. The collapse isn't loud, it's not sudden, it's not chaotic, it's structural, slow, cumulative, and far harder to reverse than anyone predicted. A revealing part of this shift is what people say when they describe why they stopped believing, or why they quietly stepped away from the religious world they grew up in. Most don't talk about dramatic arguments or confrontations. They talk about moments that felt small at the time. A conversation that didn't sit right. A claim that didn't match observable reality. A rule that felt arbitrary. A sermon that assumed questions were dangerous rather than natural. These moments accumulate, and over time they form a pattern. One of the most common themes is the experience of encountering knowledge that wasn't filtered through a religious lens for the first time. Many adults describe the shock of learning about subjects like evolutionary biology, anthropology, or biblical textual history outside a faith-based curriculum. Suddenly, the world felt bigger, more complex, more interconnected, and the explanations they'd been given as children no longer matched what they were discovering. That mismatch creates cognitive tension, and people resolve that tension by updating their view of the world rather than doubling down on something that no longer fits. The interesting part is how often this shift feels like a relief, not a loss. Because once rigid beliefs loosen, curiosity expands, and with that expansion comes a sense of intellectual freedom many people didn't realize they were missing. Then there's the psychological element. Growing up in a system that demands certainty can actually create private anxiety, because few people truly feel certain all the time. And when the expectation is total confidence, any doubt feels like failure. This creates an inner conflict that people often carry in silence when they eventually realize that doubt is not a defect, but a normal human experience. The pressure that held them inside the system weakens and sometimes collapses entirely. Another subtle but powerful factor is the modern shift toward authenticity. Younger generations especially place high value on being honest about who they are and what they really think. In environments where religious conformity is expected, authenticity becomes difficult, or sometimes impossible. You end up performing belief rather than living it. But the moment people enter spaces where they don't have to pretend, whether online, in college, or in new social circles, the performance fades. And what remains is whatever they genuinely believe or don't believe over the last 15. Researchers have also noticed something that wasn't present in earlier decades: the rise of cultural Christians. People who still call themselves believers because it feels socially safer, but who privately no longer subscribe to the doctrines. Their attendance is sporadic, their participation minimal, and their actual worldview is closer to secular thought than anything preached from a pulpit. They maintain the label the same way someone might continue wearing a school jacket long after graduation, out of habit, not conviction. This is important because cultural identity without belief is usually the final stage before people stop identifying religiously at all. It's a bridge, and once a community has enough people on that bridge, the shift accelerates. You can see the effects in public conversations. In schools, workplaces, and even family gatherings, people now hear viewpoints that used to be hidden. It's no longer uncommon for someone in a Bible Belt town to mention they're not religious, and instead of shock, the reaction is mild curiosity, sometimes silence, sometimes even agreement. That social permission didn't exist 20 years ago, and once it emerges, it expands quickly. One of the most under-discussed factors behind the Bible Belt's quiet collapse is the way technology has fragmented authority. For most of history, people received information from a small number of local institutions: family, church, community elders, local leaders. But today, information flows horizontally rather than vertically. People compare beliefs, experiences, and claims across huge networks. They can watch lectures, debates, interviews, research breakdowns, and personal testimonies from anywhere in the world. And when a local claim doesn't hold up under comparison, people notice. This doesn't necessarily lead to instant deconversion, but it does weaken the idea that truth can be contained within a single tradition. And once that belief cracks, everything else rests on much shakier ground. There's also the matter of historical transparency. People today can access analyses of ancient texts, archaeological findings, translation discrepancies, and the political processes behind scriptural formation. Information that was once limited to scholars is now accessible to anyone with a smartphone. And when people discover how complicated, contradictory, and human the origins of these texts are, the aura of divine certainty dissolves, not through anger, but through understanding. Another shift comes from observing how differently religion functions in other parts of the world. When people see how beliefs vary dramatically by geography, culture, and history, it becomes harder to maintain the idea that one regional belief system possesses exclusive truth. If someone had been born in a different country, they would almost certainly have inherited a different faith. And when that reality sinks in, the sense of inevitability around childhood belief fades. A subtle but powerful contributor to the collapse is the increased visibility of religious extremism, not just globally, but locally. When institutions fail to distance themselves clearly from harmful behaviors within their own community, people begin distancing themselves instead. The association between belief and political radicalism, even if inaccurate in many cases, creates discomfort among moderate individuals, and that discomfort leads them to quietly. There's also the issue of moral consistency. Many people describe the moment they realized that some sermons criticized the outside world more harshly than they addressed problems within their own community. When harm is minimized internally but magnified externally, people sense a double standard, and double standards erode trust faster than almost anything else. Meanwhile, the more people study psychology, sociology, and human behavior, the more obvious it becomes that belief systems often emerge from natural cognitive tendencies rather than divine intervention. Humans seek patterns, agency, meaning, and community, and religion fulfills those needs. But when people learn that these tendencies have evolutionary and neurological explanations, the supernatural layer becomes less necessary. And once the natural explanation is enough, the supernatural explanation loses its weight. The Bible Belt still looks solid from the outside, but inside, these internal shifts accumulate. They form pressure points. They form fractures. They form long-term trajectories that can't easily be reversed, and the next stage of the collapse is already unfolding. What's unfolding now is something researchers often call the tipping phase. It's the point at which individual choices quietly align into a collective shift, even if no one is organizing it. You see this in the way local churches struggle not just with attendance, but with engagement. The energy that once powered weekly events, youth programs, revivals, and community rituals has thinned, not through hostility, but through disinterest. And disinterest is far harder to combat because it isn't something you can argue with. Pastors describe something they never expected to face. People who aren't angry at religion, just indifferent to it. That indifference signals the collapse of a worldview far more than open criticism ever could. Because once people stop caring about defending or rejecting a belief system, it means the belief system has lost emotional presence in their lives. This is visible in families too, where younger members drift away quietly, and older members don't know how to respond. Many never expected to navigate conversations where faith wasn't assumed. They feel something has shifted in their household that they can't articulate, because the language they were taught to use assumes that belief is the default, not the exception. And when parents realize their children are forming identities that exist outside that default, the ground under them feels less stable. At the community level, the shift becomes visible in small signs. Church parking lots that used to overflow now have open spaces. Bible study groups that once needed multiple rooms now fit in a single circle. Youth programs that used to have waiting lists now struggle to find volunteers. These details might sound minor, but they're the metrics that leaders watch closely. And they're the ones that reveal long-term decline most clearly. A major cause of this decline is the mismatch between modern moral frameworks and the strict, older frameworks many churches still cling to. Younger generations are deeply concerned with harm reduction, consent, mental health, and personal autonomy. And when those values clash with teachings that feel rigid or punitive, a gap opens. In many places, that gap is wide enough to push entire groups of young people out of religious culture altogether. Even those who remain involved often reshape their beliefs to fit their moral intuitions, rather than the other way around. This is a profound shift. Historically, religious institutions provided moral rules that shaped personal values. Now, people use personal values to decide which religious rules still make sense to them. This reversal is one of the strongest indicators that the authority structure has weakened. There's also the matter of transparency around trauma, topics that once stayed hidden, psychological abuse, manipulation, discriminatory teaching, restrictive environments, are now discussed openly, not just in therapy offices, but in online communities and support groups, where individuals share their experiences. As these stories circulate, people realize they aren't alone, and patterns that once seemed isolated turn out to be systemic. That realization accelerates disillusionment. Another unexpected contributor to the Bible Belt's unraveling is the rise of secular role models. Past, the only people publicly celebrated in many communities were religious figures, local leaders, and conservative personalities. But now, Young people grow up watching scientists, authors, comedians, educators, and creators who speak openly about living without religion. These figures model a different way of being confident, thoughtful, and grounded, and that example subtly reshapes aspirations. The presence of alternatives matters. If you grow up seeing only one path, you follow it. If you grow up seeing multiple paths, you choose. And the act of choosing fundamentally changes the psychological structure of belief. One of the most profound shifts is happening in the area of identity. Religious identity used to be the anchor for personal identity in much of the Bible Belt. But today, people form their identity through interests, communities, personality, values, and goals, not inherited doctrines. That doesn't mean spiritual ideas disappear, but it means they no longer dominate the foundation of selfhood. This is particularly evident among Gen Z and younger millennials, who often describe religion as something optional, even in areas where it was once considered mandatory. They aren't rejecting it because they want rebellion. They're stepping back because it doesn't feel central to who they are. And when a system loses its grip on identity, it loses its long-term stability. Something else is accelerating the collapse that few people predicted: the shift in how people handle existential questions. For centuries, religion had a near monopoly on providing meaning, purpose, and comfort in the face of uncertainty. But today, people access philosophy, psychology, literature, mindfulness practices, ethical frameworks, and community support systems that offer alternative ways to process fear, loss, and doubt. These approaches don't rely on supernatural claims, and for many people, they feel more honest, more grounded, more relatable. When existential needs are met in secular ways, religious dependence decreases dramatically, not out of rejection, but out of redundancy. Another under-discussed factor is the visible disconnect between the world described in many sermons and the world people actually live in. When leaders warn of moral decay or spiritual dangers that don't match everyday experience, people notice the exaggeration, and repeated exaggeration erodes credibility. This erosion doesn't happen overnight, but once it begins, it's hard to stop. People also notice when religious teachings seem more focused on maintaining institutional power than on addressing real human needs. Whether it's political, involvement, financial pressure, or selective outrage, these patterns create quiet skepticism, and that skepticism builds across individuals until it becomes cultural. The cumulative effect is a region that looks the same on the surface, but feels different underneath. Rituals continue, the signs stay up, the language is still familiar, but the energy has changed, the assumptions have changed, the certainty has changed, the foundation has thinned, and when a foundation thins long enough, the collapse is no longer a question of if, only when. One of the clearest indicators that the collapse is accelerating is the way institutions themselves have begun reacting, not with confidence, but with urgency. Some churches have shifted their messaging to appeal to younger audiences, softening doctrines or rebranding their image. Others have doubled down on strict teachings, hoping that stronger boundaries will reinforce loyalty. But both reactions reflect the same underlying reality. The automatic adherence of past generations is gone. Institutions that feel secure don't panic. And throughout the Bible Belt, you can sense a quiet panic beneath the surface. Leaders who once spoke of certainty now speak of cultural threats. Leaders who once predicted revival now talk about fighting for the next generation. When a belief system begins framing its own survival as a battle, It signals that the cultural default has already changed. What's especially striking is that many of the people stepping away aren't doing so with resentment. They simply no longer see religion as the center of life. And, when something loses centrality, it eventually becomes background noise, still present, but no longer defining. As people pull away, they often talk about a growing sense of coherence in their worldview, not because they suddenly gained all the answers, but because their understanding of reality no longer requires constant mental adjustments to reconcile ancient texts with modern knowledge. That coherence feels stable. And once someone experiences stability without relying on a belief system, returning to that system becomes unlikely. Another phenomenon that sociologists highlight is the leak effect. When one person in a family or friend group becomes openly non-religious, others who had private doubts feel safer acknowledging their own. 10. This creates a chain reaction, not because people convince each other, but because they finally feel free to be honest. It turns out that many individuals who thought they were alone in their skepticism were surrounded by others who felt the same way, but stayed silent. The leak effect is especially strong in workplaces and schools, where a casual conversation can reveal that someone who seemed devout is actually questioning privately. Every time that happens, the illusion of uniform belief weakens. And once the illusion weakens, the pressure to conform collapses. Another major shift has to do with the role of education, not just higher education, but exposure to diverse fields of knowledge. Someone who spends time studying history, linguistics, neuroscience, or critical thinking inevitably encounters ideas that complicate literalist interpretations of Scripture. For many people, this isn't threatening, it's enlightening. They begin understanding texts as products of their time, shaped by human authors with cultural biases and limited scientific understanding. And once you see texts as human, you can't unsee it. That realization doesn't always lead to hostility toward religion. Often it leads to a quieter conclusion. The stories may still hold cultural or literary value, but they don't define reality. Once that distinction becomes clear, belief transforms, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly, but always directionally. Economic instability in the region has also played a surprising role. When communities face financial stress, people often turn to religious institutions for support. But when those institutions are themselves struggling, they can't provide the stability they once did. Some churches close, others merge, others reduce programs. And when the visible strength of an institution declines, people begin questioning its divine backing, because if a system relies on human fundraising and marketing strategies to survive, its supernatural credibility feels weaker. This creates another subtle shift. People begin treating churches like local organizations rather than sacred authorities. They evaluate them based on usefulness, transparency, competence, and alignment with personal values, not divine mandate. Once institutions are viewed through that lens, their power dynamic changes. They no longer command loyalty, they must earn it. Community dynamics reveal another significant pressure point. In many Bible Belt towns, younger adults now form friendships that include people who are religious, non-religious, spiritual but undefined, culturally Christian, or entirely secular. This diversity of belief within social circles was rare in previous generations, and it changes everything. Because once non-religion becomes normalized socially, it spreads without ever needing to be promoted. Identity shifts, not through debate but through exposure, and that exposure is now constant. Another factor reshaping the region is the decline of fear-based messaging. For decades, fear played a central role in maintaining adherence. Fear of punishment, fear of leaving the group, fear of being wrong, fear of disappointing family, fear of eternal consequences. But modern psychological research has made people more aware of how fear is used to influence behavior. And once you recognize a fear tactic as a tactic, its power dissolves. People often describe feeling lighter after stepping away from fear-driven belief systems, not because life becomes easier, but because their internal world becomes more honest. That honesty slowly undermines institutions built on emotional pressure. There's also the matter of accountability. Many religious authorities in the past operated without scrutiny because the community trusted them unconditionally, but in the modern environment, leaders are no longer shielded from criticism. Stories spread, inconsistencies surface, decisions are questioned, and institutions that once operated above inspection now face a level of transparency they were never designed to withstand. This accountability isn't inherently negative, but it destabilizes institutions that relied on unquestioned authority, and many did. You see the effects most clearly in conversations that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Teenagers casually discussing why they no longer find religious explanations convincing young adults. Analyzing the psychology of belief rather than assuming it, parents reading about child development and questioning doctrines they once accepted without thought. These shifts don't happen in isolation. They accumulate across households, across schools, across entire counties. This accumulation changes the cultural atmosphere. It makes disbelief feel normal. It makes belief feel optional. And once a belief system becomes optional, in a region where it was once mandatory, the collapse may slow at times, but it never fully reverses, because cultural momentum doesn't move backward, it only moves forward. And the forward motion in the Bible Belt is unmistakable. There's a quieter shift, happening beneath all the headlines about church closures, political fights, and cultural pushback. And it might be the most important one of all. People are beginning to ask questions they never felt free to ask before. Questions that once felt dangerous inside the Bible Belt now feel like necessary parts of adulthood. Questions that don't automatically lead to rebellion or hostility, but simply to clarity. Why did I believe what I believed? Where did those ideas come from? And do they still make sense now that I'm living my own life? For generations, those questions were treated as threats, as if curiosity itself could unravel a soul, as if uncertainty meant failure instead of growth. But something shifted when the internet arrived. Suddenly, a teenager in a rural town had access to the same scholarship as a college professor. A young parent could listen to thinkers outside the narrow boundaries of their upbringing. A churchgoer could study history, psychology, archaeology, all without anyone watching over their shoulder. And once that freedom arrived, it couldn't be taken away. That's one of the biggest cracks in the Bible Belt's foundation. Authority used to be enforced through isolation. You only heard one interpretation, one worldview, one explanation for how life works. Now people can compare, they can verify, they can fact-check sermons in real time. And when the evidence doesn't match the claims, it leaves a mark. Not an angry mark, not a rebellious mark, just a quiet realization that the world is bigger than the boundaries they were taught. You can't undo that. This shift created a divide no preacher ever prepared for. The gap between what people say they believe publicly and what they actually think privately. Some attend out of habit. Some attend out of fear. Some attend because it keeps the peace at home. But inside, they're no longer convinced in the way they once were. That internal divide was small at first. A single unanswered question here and there. But over time, those small questions accumulated, layer by layer, until the pressure became too much. That's when something else started happening. People began realizing they weren't alone. One person would leave a church, and others would quietly say, "I've been thinking the same thing for years." A family would step away, and suddenly 2 or 3 more families felt brave enough to do the same. A pastor would resign, and the silence would break open suddenly. The whole congregation admitted they'd been struggling too. When people feel alone in doubt, they stay quiet. When they realize doubt is everywhere, they start talking. And that's when a cultural shift becomes a collapse. Because once honest conversation starts, the old structures can't hold. You can't maintain a system built on certainty when certainty itself is dissolving. Something else happened as well, something almost invisible unless you're looking for it. People began forming new kinds of relationships. Friendships that weren't tied to church attendance. Communities that didn't require shared beliefs. Social networks that didn't demand conformity. And here's the part that surprises many inside the old system. Those new relationships often feel healthier, kinder, and more stable than the ones they left behind, because they're based on choice, not obligation. Respect, not hierarchy. Curiosity, not fear. That shift, that widening of the social world, removes the final barrier. When your entire life revolves around a church community, leaving feels impossible. When your relationships expand beyond it, leaving becomes survivable. And once it becomes survivable, it becomes inevitable for many. The collapse didn't begin with anger. It didn't begin with rebellion. It began with conversations. People talking honestly about their doubts, their experiences, their questions, and realizing that the answers they were given no longer match the reality they live in. What makes this moment historic is that these conversations are happening everywhere at once, in living rooms, in workplaces, at school events, on porches, in coffee shops, and, quietly, late at night, between partners who finally feel safe enough to tell the truth. The Bible Belt isn't cracking because people are becoming worse. It's cracking because people are becoming more honest and more connected and more informed than ever before. And honesty has a way of reshaping entire cultures. There's another part of this shift that rarely gets talked about, something subtle, but powerful enough to change an entire region over time. It's the realization that a moral life doesn't need a religious framework to exist. And for a lot of people raised in the Bible Belt, that's a completely new experience. For generations, morality was presented as something that only worked inside the church. If you stepped outside that structure, the assumption was that your values would collapse with it. Goodness was treated like a property the church owned, and leaving meant losing access to it. But as people drifted from the system, they discovered something surprising. Their sense of empathy didn't disappear. Their compassion didn't fade. Their desire to be fair, kind, and responsible didn't evaporate. If anything, those qualities often became sharper once fear was no longer involved. When morality isn't driven by the fear of consequences, it becomes something deeper, something chosen, something grounded in understanding rather than obedience. And that idea, the idea that goodness can stand on its own, is one of the most destabilizing truths for any belief system built on authority. Because once people understand they can be honest, decent, ethical human beings without the entire religious framework holding them in place, the emotional grip weakens. That's not rebellion, that's growth. And growth changes everything. A big piece of the collapse is also practical. Research shows that regions with stronger social safety nets, better education, and healthier community institutions tend to see a decline in traditional religiosity. Not because people turn against faith, but because they no longer need religion to meet basic emotional or social needs. In the Bible Belt, churches often functioned as the default support system. If you lost a job, the church helped. If you didn't have childcare, church families stepped in. If you were lonely, the church gave you a place to belong. But over the last 2 decades, other forms of support have grown: community groups, online spaces, volunteer networks, therapy, mutual aid, social programs. People now have options that don't require participation in a religious community, and options create freedom. Once people realize they have a choice, the pressure that kept them inside the system fades. Some stay, some don't. But the dynamic shifts from obligation to preference, and institutions built on obligation struggle to survive that shift. Meanwhile, younger generations are watching all this happen with a completely different set of expectations. They're not afraid to ask questions. They're not afraid to walk away. And they're not impressed by authority based on tradition alone. The old idea that doubt was dangerous, or disrespectful, or even sinful no longer carries the same force. You can't tell a generation raised on information that a question is off limits. And that matters, because questioning doesn't weaken a belief system that's grounded in truth, it strengthens it. But it does weaken a system built on fragile claims, social pressure, or unquestioned assumptions. And that's exactly where the Bible Belt is starting to feel the strain. Another shift is happening at the psychological level. People are learning to separate their identity from their belief system. Instead of seeing faith as who they are, they're seeing it as something they once held. A set of ideas can be re-evaluated. A system can be questioned. A worldview can evolve. When identity and belief become uncoupled, change becomes possible. It creates space, the kind of internal space where people can ask themselves what they actually think, not what they're supposed to think. And once that space opens up, it rarely closes again. There's also a growing recognition of the emotional weight many people carried for years without acknowledging it. Guilt, fear, pressure to conform, pressure to appear certain, pressure to live up to standards no human could honestly meet. Stepping away doesn't erase that weight immediately, but it does reveal how unnecessary it always was. For many people, the collapse isn't a crisis, it's a release from fear, a release from shame, a release from pretending, a release from the constant tension between who they were expected to be and who they actually are. And that release creates a kind of clarity that can be felt across entire communities. The Bible Belt isn't cracking because people have suddenly turned away from meaning. It's cracking because people are searching for meaning that doesn't depend on fear, control, or inherited beliefs. Meaning that can evolve. Meaning that comes from experience. Meaning that grows with them instead of trapping them. And once people realize the world is bigger than the walls they grew up inside, it's hard to go back to thinking those walls were the entire universe. There's a deeper shift unfolding too, one that doesn't show up in statistics, but you can feel it in the tone of conversations happening across the Bible Belt. People are starting to value sincerity over certainty, and that single shift rewrites the entire cultural script. For so long, certainty was the highest currency. You weren't respected for thinking carefully. You were respected for appearing confident. Questions weren't signs of intelligence. They were signs of weakness. Nuance wasn't encouraged. It was treated as compromise. But certainty comes with a cost. It makes people defensive. It creates pressure to maintain the illusion of perfect belief. It turns honest self-reflection into something dangerous. Now, something very different is happening. People are choosing sincerity, the willingness to speak what they actually feel, even if it's incomplete. They're choosing to say, "I'm not sure," instead of pretending to have every answer. They're choosing authenticity over performance. And that alone is enough to weaken systems built on the appearance of unity. Because when people stop performing belief, you discover how many were only performing it in the first place. This shift is showing up in churches too. Attendance may still look solid in some places, but the energy has changed. The room is quieter, the enthusiasm is softer. The sense of urgency that once kept everyone aligned is fading. People sit in the pews, but their minds are somewhere else. They listen, but they're evaluating. They participate, but not out of conviction, more out of habit or respect for their families, or simply because leaving is still too complicated. But even silent questioning has power. It accumulates, it spreads. It becomes a quiet network of people who no longer see the world through the same lens they did 10 years ago. And once that network gets big enough, collapse stops being an event and becomes a slow realignment. Another crack in the foundation comes from the increasingly obvious mismatch between the teachings people hear and the reality they live. Grand claims don't hold up when real-life experience contradicts them every day. People grow tired of hearing promises that never match their outcomes. They're tired of fear-based narratives that no longer resonate. They're tired of moral systems that fail to address real-world complexity. They're tired of being told the world works one way while watching it operate in a completely different way. When teachings stop matching reality, the teachings lose credibility, not because people are rebellious, but because they're perceptive. And perception is one of the most powerful forces in cultural change. People see patterns even when they're not allowed to talk about them. They sense inconsistencies even when no one acknowledges them. They notice the gap between rhetoric and reality, and once they see it, it's impossible to unsee. There's also a growing recognition of how much human complexity was flattened for the sake of conformity. People are tired of pretending they fit perfectly into frameworks that never accounted for the full range of human experience. They're tired of oversimplified explanations for problems that require nuance, empathy, and expertise. Life is complicated. Human psychology is complicated. Relationships, identity, purpose, none of these fit into neat, pre-written templates. The old system offered answers that were too simple for the complexity of reality. And as people encounter more of that complexity through education, through relationships, through the internet, simple answers start to feel hollow. This doesn't create emptiness. It creates curiosity. Curiosity for better explanations. Curiosity for evidence. Curiosity for frameworks that acknowledge the real world instead of shrinking it. And curiosity, once awakened, is incredibly difficult to suppress. The collapse isn't happening because people have lost values. It's happening because they're seeking values that grow with them instead of trapping them. Values that don't require denying reality. Values that build resilience instead of fear. Values that respect human complexity instead of punishing it. All of these shifts, sincerity over certainty, authenticity over performance, complexity over simplicity, are reshaping the cultural landscape in ways that don't reverse easily. And the most revealing part is this. People aren't walking away from faith because they're angry. They're walking away because they've outgrown a system that wasn't built for the world they actually live in. The Bible Belt is cracking open, not because something went wrong, but because people are finally giving themselves permission to think, question, grow, and evolve. One of the subtler but most powerful forces behind this shift is the quiet expansion of perspective. For decades, the Bible Belt operated within a kind of cultural echo chamber. Information, interpretation, and authority all came from a very small set of sources: family, local leaders, and the church itself. That meant people rarely encountered perspectives that challenged their assumptions in meaningful ways. Now, that is changing. The digital age, mobility, and access to education have exposed people to ideas that would have been nearly impossible to encounter 20 or 30 years ago. Young adults read books, watch lectures, listen to podcasts, and talk to people from entirely different backgrounds. They hear alternative explanations for morality, history, human behavior, and even religious traditions. And over time, exposure to these perspectives subtly reshapes the way they interpret everything they were taught as children. It doesn't always happen suddenly. It's not usually dramatic. It's a slow process, a layering of new understanding over old assumptions. And the result is that beliefs which once felt unquestionable now feel negotiable. At the same time, the gap between what people see in their communities and what they hear in sermons has grown. Inequality, injustice, and hypocrisy, once easy to dismiss as the work of fallen humans, are now impossible to ignore. When people experience real-world consequences that contradict the moral claims of the institution, the trust that once upheld the system begins to erode. Faith, after all, depends on credibility. When credibility fades, adherence follows. There's also an important social element. People who step away from traditional belief often find themselves forming new communities that feel more supportive, more authentic, and more aligned with their lived experience. These communities are not inherently religious or secular, they simply exist outside the old structures. And as those networks grow, the pull of the church diminishes. Once you realize that belonging doesn't require compliance, participation becomes optional. Once participation becomes optional, decline accelerates. This is compounded by the generational effect. Young adults who grow up questioning the system rarely feel compelled to pass rigid beliefs to their own children. Instead, they pass on critical thinking, curiosity, and a sense of moral responsibility untethered to doctrine. The ripple effect compounds over decades. By the time these families reach middle age, the local culture is subtly, irreversibly transformed. Another force at work is psychological. Many people raised in strict environments experience anxiety, guilt, or fear associated with belief. When they step away and find their values intact, often stronger and more intentional than before, they realize that the emotional weight of obligation is unnecessary. Freed from fear-based reinforcement, their worldview becomes more coherent, more resilient, and more self-directed. This, in turn, weakens the institutions further. Churches rely on participation, engagement, and compliance to sustain themselves. When people are freed from obligation but remain ethically engaged in other spheres of life, the system's energy collapses quietly but dramatically. You can still see the buildings. You can still see the rituals. But the power that once animated them has shifted elsewhere. And here's the most striking thing. None of this is abrupt. There's no single event that triggered a mass exodus. There's no sudden rebellion. The collapse is cumulative. It is the sum of small choices, private doubts, honest conversations, and gradual exposure to reality over decades. And once a culture reaches this point, reversal becomes nearly impossible. People don't unlearn awareness. They don't unsee hypocrisy. They don't unexperience freedom. The Bible Belt is cracking open quietly, steadily, and inexorably. And the collapse no one saw coming is happening not with a bang, but with the quiet, unstoppable force of truth meeting lived experience. Another element accelerating this shift is the generational transfer of skepticism. Parents who were once deeply enmeshed in religious structures now face the reality that their children are thinking for themselves and thinking critically. It's not an act of rebellion, it's simply curiosity applied consistently over time. Younger generations observe discrepancies between preaching and practice, between promises and reality, between moral claims and societal outcomes, and they integrate that awareness into their worldview. They do not blindly accept explanations because they are convenient or comforting. Instead, they seek coherence, a system of thought that aligns with both evidence and lived experience. And as they form communities around these principles, in schools, workplaces, online forums, and social groups, the cultural authority of the church diminishes further. At the same time, the Bible Belt is experiencing another subtle but decisive shift: the reframing of purpose. Faith once offered a singular pathway to meaning. You were born, you were saved, you were meant to serve, and life made sense in the context of divine narrative. Step outside that narrative, and it felt disorienting. But modern life offers alternatives. Purpose is increasingly self-defined, grounded in relationships, contribution, creativity, and learning, rather than dictated by doctrine. And when purpose can be found outside the walls of a church, the church's centrality begins to erode. The effect is cumulative. A young adult leaves for college or moves to a city. They encounter peers, mentors, and media that normalize questioning and critical thinking. They discover that moral and ethical living is possible without adherence to religious authority. They see families who thrive outside traditional frameworks. They realize that belonging, connection, and purpose are not monopolized by institutions. Small individual choices aggregate into a broader cultural pattern, and suddenly what was once considered normal becomes optional, then negotiable, then secondary. This also changes the dynamic within churches themselves. Communities that once relied on unquestioned loyalty must now compete for attention, engagement, and emotional energy. Some respond by softening doctrines, modernizing messaging, or repackaging tradition to appeal to younger demographics. Others double down on rigidity, hoping to preserve identity through pressure. Both approaches reveal the same truth: the system is no longer inherently self-sustaining. Another factor is the exposure to global perspectives. People who move away, travel, or even explore online communities discover that belief is not monolithic. The realization that Christianity is one of many belief systems, each shaped by culture, history, and human interpretation, undermines the sense of inevitability that once supported adherence. Belief becomes a choice, not an obligation. And once belief becomes a choice, decline accelerates. The result is an invisible but undeniable pattern. A region that looks outwardly stable but is quietly, structurally changing. Church attendance fluctuates. Youth programs shrink. Sermons are met with polite skepticism, and participation is motivated more by habit than conviction. It is the quiet unraveling of authority, trust, and unquestioned narrative. It is a shift that cannot easily be reversed because it is grounded in lived experience, observation, and self-directed understanding. And yet, the most striking aspect of this collapse is its subtlety. There is no dramatic showdown, no widespread conflict, no headlines proclaiming a mass abandonment. Instead, it is cumulative, quiet, steady, a network of small choices forming a movement too large to stop. The Bible Belt is cracking open not because its people are angry or reckless or immoral. It is cracking because they are learning, thinking, questioning, and living. And life is rarely reversed once it is lived in full. Another crucial piece of the story is how quietly generational habits are shifting. Religious participation was once reinforced by daily routines: Sunday services, midweek meetings, volunteer hours, prayer circles, youth programs. Those routines weren't just spiritual, they were social glue. They bound people together, created expectation, and made leaving psychologically costly. But now, those routines are breaking down. Some people skip services once, others stop attending youth programs. Some churches experiment with online streaming or small groups, but participation is inconsistent. The effect compounds. When routines weaken, social reinforcement weakens. When reinforcement weakens, obligation weakens. And when obligation weakens, belief is no longer a default assumption, it becomes optional. What was once assumed that everyone believed, everyone followed, everyone conformed, is now a spectrum. Some people show up, some observe from the sidelines, some quietly step away. And across a population, small variations create a tipping point. Technology has amplified this effect. People can explore alternative philosophies, watch debates, read historical analyses, and connect with like-minded individuals outside their community without leaving their hometown. Exposure isn't just casual, it is constant and self-directed. When someone sees multiple perspectives not as an abstract concept, but as real lived experience, the authority of local institutions is undermined organically. Meanwhile, the stories people were told as children no longer align with reality. Miraculous narratives, moral absolutes, and divine promises clash with observable outcomes. People notice, they process, they adapt. This isn't rebellion, it isn't outrage, it is awareness. And awareness spreads quietly, steadily, and irrevocably. Economic and social stressors also play a surprising role in this transformation. Communities that once relied on churches for mutual aid and social stability now see alternative networks emerge. Online communities, local non-profits, and secular volunteering programs. Where people once depended on faith-based structures for childcare, counseling, or social support, viable alternatives now exist. This changes the calculus of belief. If participation in religion is no longer the only path to social and emotional stability, the incentive to adhere weakens. The result isn't chaos, it's choice. Choice that slowly, subtly reshapes culture. Generational observation accelerates the effect. Children of parents who are quietly skeptical or selectively observant often inherit an approach to belief that prioritizes questioning and critical thinking. Rather than passively absorbing doctrines, they test ideas against reality, weigh them against evidence, and integrate what resonates. Over decades, these incremental shifts accumulate into a profound cultural transformation. Even political influence, long intertwined with religious authority, is affected. Communities that once voted uniformly based on religious leadership now exhibit fragmentation, reflecting the underlying diversity of belief. When political alignment no longer guarantees social cohesion, the perceived power of religious institutions diminishes further. All of this adds up to a subtle but unstoppable structural change. The appearance of stability remains: church buildings, Sunday gatherings, holiday events, but the internal cohesion that sustained those structures is eroding. Psychology also offers insight into the Bible Belt's quiet unraveling. People are increasingly aware that morality, purpose, and meaning do not require supernatural justification. Cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, and social studies demonstrate that humans develop empathy, fairness, and cooperation naturally. These discoveries remove one of the pillars that once upheld religious adherence: the idea that ethical behavior is inseparable from belief. The liberation is profound. People discover they can live morally, ethically, and purposefully without guilt-driven oversight or eternal consequences. Once the connection between fear and morality weakens, the emotional reinforcement that maintained belief fades. Social observation compounds the effect. Seeing peers, mentors, and role models navigate life successfully outside of religious frameworks reinforces the notion that faith is not the only path to thriving. This normalization is quiet but powerful. Once disbelief is seen as possible without chaos, participation becomes voluntary rather than obligatory. The cumulative effect of these factors, education, exposure, generational change, social networks, psychological insight, and alternatives for support and purpose, is a slow, structural collapse. It is a collapse that does not require conflict, controversy, or scandal. It occurs because the assumptions that once upheld the system no longer hold. Because reality, observation, and self-directed thought gradually outweigh inherited belief. And finally, the most remarkable aspect of this transformation is how quiet it is. There is no dramatic revolution, no mass exodus in the streets, no violent clash between tradition and modernity. Instead, the shift is incremental, layered, and cumulative. Small choices, repeated over time, create the conditions for systemic change. Conversations in living rooms, questions asked in schools, books read, videos watched, ideas exchanged. These everyday acts, multiplied across millions of people, gradually reshape culture. The Bible Belt is cracking not because its people are angry, not because they have abandoned morality, not because they lack community. It is cracking because people are thinking, because they are observing, because they are growing, because they are choosing for themselves. And once that choice spreads, reversal is nearly impossible. The collapse no one saw coming is not dramatic. It is inevitable. It is human. And it is quietly, profoundly transforming the region from the inside out.